I'm here with Simon Ruda, Senior Policy Advisor for the Behavioural Insights team at the Cabinet Office, commonly known as the Nudge Unit. Simon, what does the Nudge Unit do, and why is it different from the normal way in which government thinks about decision making?
So Nick, what we do is we draw on lessons from behavioural science and try and apply them to public policy in order to generate more positive solutions for the public.
So can you give me an example of an idea that's come from thinking about human behaviour rather than, for example, traditional economic analysis?
So one thing we tried to do with job centres was to change the nature of the relationship between the customer and the job centre. I think previously it had been felt that job centres were steeped in bureaucratic processes. So we tried to minimise those processes and focus straight on the heart of what do I do in order to get a job.
So presumably from a sort of conventional economic point of view, all of those behavioural aspects or the sort of emotional aspects of the stresses of going into a job centre, your perception of whether they're on your side or not, the fear of the bureaucracy, that's stuff that's very hard to even see in an economic analysis. Presumably you're more thinking from that more conventional point of view of the value that the job centre may or may not give you in providing benefits and also potentially providing a job. Presumably you're trying to sort of look beneath the bonnet a bit and get a sense of what's going on in people's heads as they work and so on the other side and as a customer.
Previously in this particular job centre, customers were asked to look for at least 3 jobs in every 2 weeks, and we know for a fact that that isn't really enough jobs to look for when you're looking for work. And plus, obviously we're not prohibiting people from looking for more jobs, but by saying 3 we're essentially anchoring them quite low. So instead of that we developed a commitment device which was forward-looking rather than retrospective. So when job seekers came into the job centres, we asked them, what is it that you're going to do specifically? So I will look for this kind of job on this day at this time, and I'll do it on this website. And then they make a commitment with the job centre, the job seeker and the job seeker advisor, and they go away, and we found that from results it was quite effective at increasing the amount of people who were finding employment.
So those suggestions came from interesting ideas in the behavioural science literature that have been around for some time. I'm wondering what the process was that led you to draw on those particular ideas and apply them in the way that you did.
So the job centre trial came about 2 years into us being familiar with these processes and doing behavioural insights trials as a team. So at this stage we'd already become quite ingrained with some of the existing literature. But before we start any project, one of the most important things that we try to do is to try and embed ourselves in some of the relevant literature. Now, it's not always the case that there'll be some empirical data or trials in the past on the specific behaviour that we're trying to change, but a lot of the time you'll find useful information on analogous markers. With regard to the friction costs, I think we found a lot of interesting analysis around some of the previous work that we've done with tax trials. So we found, for example, that telling people that they could fill in their tax return forms at a specific, the website of the specific form rather than the landing page, which they then have to find the form from, increased the amount of people who filled in their tax returns. So you can see in different examples how these hidden friction costs can really impact on people achieving what they ultimately intend to achieve.
And of course economists also talk about friction costs, but they value those in monetary terms. So they'd be thinking, the friction cost is something that is taking you time to overcome, and that time is worth money, so we can sort of put them into our economic analysis. But I guess your suggestion is that actually those friction costs can be deeper than that. So they can be things that make the whole task something you just want to abandon, that you just don't fancy even trying.
Completely. I mean, one of our suspicions is that with switching energy tariffs, for example, or finding the right mobile phone tariff is something that's massively impeded by the fact that you subconsciously know, I'm going to have to search through a load of stuff in order to find what I want. We know that most people are on the wrong energy tariff, and actually a good percentage of people, when they do switch energy tariff, end up switching to an energy tariff which is even worse. So the challenge for us is, what can we do to enable them to find the right tariffs for their needs? How can we work with businesses to ultimately get people what they should be finding themselves?
And one element of your work is drawing on existing behavioural insights, but of course another critical question is testing the ideas that you generate in the real world, because as you say, it's very rare that there's a previous study on exactly the thing you're looking at. So from a behavioural science point of view, your natural inclination would be to say, okay, so let's try these things out and see how they fare. How far has that been possible to do in the context of government?
That's absolutely right. And I think when we first started along this road 2 and a bit years ago, there was, it's fair to say, a certain degree of hesitation among colleagues in other departments to conduct a randomized control trial, because I think people naturally feel that this is an expensive, long-term process. But actually, depending on the kind of data that you're trying to measure, it can be done quite rapidly and very cheaply. So what we've tried to do in almost all the areas that we've worked in so far is to start off with a relatively small-scale trial and get some results, repeat it if necessary to adapt the findings, to adapt the processes in order to achieve the findings that you want before you scale up. In an ideal situation, we'd see national policy rolled out, constantly evolving. So you'd still have a section of the population randomly assigned to a control group, a small section randomly assigned to a treatment group. So you continually evolve the policy and make sure that it's constantly being as effective as it can be.
So thinking broader than the UK, how much experimental policy development is there going on across the world, and how is that changing over time?
I think we're seeing a lot of interest from other countries right now, certainly international organisations as well, who are interested in the stuff that we do, because they face similar challenges as well. They know that in different contexts, different policies don't always work, and it's very expensive to find out after 10 years that your policy hasn't worked and you've put all this time and effort and money into it. So what are the kind of more rapid and cheaper and more effective ways of finding out whether or not something is working? And we've really seen an increase in interest in the application of randomized control trials into public policy or empirical testing more generally. I think, funnily enough, it's outside of the domestic policy arena, actually in development policy, where they've had a longer history of using randomized control trials to measure effectiveness. But even so, I think colleagues working in development policy would be the first to recognise that they've got a little bit to go as well. So we're really beginning to see an increase in interest in this, and our team are completely supportive of that.
So you mentioned randomized control trials, and of course in experimental psychology and behavioural science in general, there's been a lot of emphasis on very carefully controlled laboratory trials, but that challenge of keeping things very carefully controlled and very easy to analyse the precise causal relationships, that's so much more difficult in the real world. And of course people in medicine and agriculture have spent many decades figuring out how to do this. Can you say a bit about how randomized control trials apply in the context of policy?
Absolutely. So I think I'll start off with an example, and then you can derive the principles from that. So when we were sending out tax letters, different people have different opinions as to which tax letter will be most effective at getting people to pay their tax. This is people who obviously are on self-assessment tax and haven't paid already. How do we know which is more effective? Well, we'll trial it. So essentially, we randomly assign receivers of the tax letter to either a control group, which might be an existing tax letter, and then a treatment group, which is our variant of the tax letter, and then possibly other treatment groups as well, if we have a large enough sample size to trial more than one letter at a time. We then measure the data, which is being measured anyway, to find out which of the recipients of the particular kind of letter pay their tax, and then we compare the proportions. What's important is that you need to have a statistically significant sample, which essentially means that you need enough people in your samples to make sure as you can be, that the results you're getting aren't due to chance.
Right.
So
give me an example of the kind of effect you found with tax letters, because you might think that one tax letter is much like another, people don't read them anyway. It really isn't going to be a very powerful lever to change the wording on a letter. That's just a hopeless task. And presumably governments did sort of think this in the past because they didn't spend a lot of time fine-tuning it. Is it really possible to make a difference? Absolutely.
And of all the things that we found out in 2.5 years of operating in numerous policy areas, is that details matter. So we sent a number of tax letters out in order to get people these were first-time tax debtors who hadn't paid their tax. And in some of the letters, we told them that actually the majority of people in your particular town, and we named the town, had paid their tax already, and that the people receiving the letters were one of the few that hadn't. We compared that against the standard letter, which was the same otherwise, but it didn't have that line in it, and we saw a 15 percentage point difference in the two. So the one that employed social norms, telling people that most people in their town had paid their tax already, was more successful. What's particularly interesting about that example is that previously in focus groups, we'd ask people what would make them pay their tax. And they said, well, knowing what the tax is spent on, that would make me pay my tax. Social norms telling me that most people have paid, it wouldn't make any difference. When we put it into a trial, telling people what the money is spent on made no difference whatsoever.
Right. So that's interesting. So people, it illustrates the point that people have often very weak insights into their own behaviour, and also, of course, that people are often governing their behaviour by clues from what others are doing, rather than somehow mysteriously looking inside their own preferences and following those.
The interesting point is that when you appreciate how important these tiny little details are, and thus how important it is to test things empirically, it massively changes the power structure within government. So for us, it's a huge learning that we find that actually the people who are making the decisions at the top of the building and the big committee table may not have as much impact as the people designing the form or designing the letter somewhere in the basement.
Yeah. So you can make a policy decision, which was actually a good policy decision, but due to some tiny implementational detail not being tweaked quite correctly, the policy might nonetheless fail.
Absolutely.
So governments are very well stocked with economists and lawyers and other professions. They don't have many behavioural scientists. Do you think that might be set to change?
I can say with confidence that over the past 3 years, the number of behavioural scientists has increased exponentially, but that was from a base of 0. So maybe it will continue in that trend.
But we want to be careful to extrapolate too easily. Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.